Our next guest began as a laser physicist and somehow morphed that hard science into becoming a parapsychologist, working with the Stanford Research Institute for the CIA. That's where they made many incredible breakthrough discoveries regarding remote viewing. Today, what we hope to get to the bottom of is how does a brilliant, hard scientific guy like Russell get to the point where he believes and accepts such unsolid things as the mind being separate from the body, our consciousness surviving death, and parapsychological ideas such as ESP and remote viewing. He is a self-proclaimed reformed, logical positivist, and is truly a great honor to have him here on the show today. We hope to see him at Contact in the Desert. If it happens, that's our plan. We'll see. Please welcome to the show, Mr. Russel Targ. Hi, Russell.
Well, I'm happy to be with you.
Last time you were here, we spoke a lot about your great movie, Third Eye Spies, which we'll get to today. But we'd also like to try something a little different and kind of go back to the beginning here and talk real briefly about a couple of these other things. Like there's the idea of remote viewing, or not necessarily remote viewing, but certainly the idea of consciousness existing outside the body, going way back from earlier authors like Aristotle and Nagarjuna and other authors, right? Can you address that a little bit?
Well, Nagarjuna and Aristotle disagree. First of all, the guy right over my left shoulder here is Padmasambhava. He's a great Buddhist teacher. He's the one who moved Buddhism from India to Tibet. So he's the inventor of Tibetan Buddhism. And he wrote a book called Self-Liberation Through Seeing with Naked Awareness. And that sounds a lot like what we're talking about now. He says self-liberation means you can learn who you are, learn your nature, which he says is timeless awareness, through seeing with naked awareness. And he wrote that in the 8th century. So He was telling you that you can see into the distance, see into the future, quiet your mind. And by the way, since your nature is timeless awareness, for example, in a precognitive dream, you can dream tonight about what you're going to see tomorrow. Many, many people have their first experiences with psychic functioning in a precognitive dream. The very, very common phenomena. He was aware that this timeless awareness means that your consciousness is free of cause and effect. And he said, you're not limited by cause and effect because you can see into the future. In fact, your nature has you moving through space and time if you're willing or able to get rid of the meat and potatoes who you think you are. And this is all in the 8th century.
Yeah, 1,200 years ago, they were saying that's amazing.
So this is not, I'm telling you about Padmasambhava because this is not New Age, that he was a revered Buddhist teacher, in fact, is a revered Buddhist teacher, because he was the one who first put this all down, that this book, Self-Liberation Through Seeing with Naked Awareness, is something that a New Age writer might put forward to give you an inspiration to see with naked awareness. It sounds a lot like remote viewing.
Very much so. It's interesting that it's so old, yeah.
He understood how to do it, that it's your nature, and he understood that guessing and trying to name what you're seeing is the enemy of psychic functioning. He was aware that you have to learn to separate the psychic signal from the mental noise. And this is all in the 800s. In Tibet, he was writing this down. He said, if you don't want to suffer, of course, the goal of Buddhism is not doctrinaire. Buddhists don't want you to believe anything in particular. Buddhists give you a toolkit to diminish your suffering and hopefully the suffering of all people. And he said that if you can realize that your nature is not meat and potatoes, but nature is timeless awareness, that can greatly diminish your suffering as in a time that such as we have right now.
It's fascinating that such a high concept was so long ago. It's interesting that people thought that way that long ago. Doc, real quick, I wanted to say how in parapsychology, it's tough for people outside of this community to get their head around. And I'd like to point out that in science, a lot of mainstream physics ideas are equally challenging for us to get our heads around. Like maybe we could just really quickly speak to like the observer effect of the double slit experiment, or Schrodinger's cat, those kind of things. Those are mainstream ideas that are still really difficult for people to sort of get their head around.
Well, the observer effect is Schrodinger's double. The observer effect is Schrodinger's cat phenomena. Right. What Schrodinger said is that the cat is in the box and he might be alive or he might be dead, and you can't tell whether he's alive or dead until you look. In fact, it's not proper to say that he's alive or dead until you look. And in psychic phenomena, one of the things that is most sympathetic with modern physics is the idea of non-locality. That is the thing that we did a program involving remote viewing, looking into the distance, looking into the future. I don't know if you can see on the wall, I have a picture of a group of windmills on a hillside where somebody was able to draw those windmills. He was 100 miles away, and all he knew is that the CIA guy he met in the morning would be hiding someplace in the Bay Area 2 hours from then. Can he describe where he is? And what he drew is a bunch of windmills on a hillside, and it's a perfect match for the photograph that was taken later on.
That's Pat Price,
so
right?
He could see into the distance, and the thing that parapsychologists all over the world agree on is that it's no harder to describe something in the future than it is to describe something contemporaneous. Similarly, it's no harder to describe something far away. As we did our experiments in Menlo Park, California, and one of the places we spent a lot of time looking at was Soviet Siberia, is 6,000 miles away, and our descriptions of Soviet Siberia were just as good as the pictures of the windmill 100 miles away in the hills of the Sierras. So distance and time absolutely do not interfere with the accuracy or reliability of psychic functioning. And this idea of non-locality is a very hot topic in modern physics, because they're discovering that many things in the microscopic world of quantum physics are independent of space and time. Things that occur in the future can be said to be the cause of things that occur at an earlier time. And that's not what you normally expect. You normally expect if the wagon moves a little bit down the street, it's a result of having a push at an earlier time, not something that happened at the later time. But many things in the psychic world and in the quantum world occur later. For example, one of our famous experiments as I left SRI was forecasting changes in the silver commodity future. And everybody knows you can't do that as a magic trick. If you're able to forecast the silver future, is because somehow you're able to look into the future and describe what's going to occur. And we did that 9 weeks in a row. We were able to forecast whether silver was going up a little, up a lot, down a little, or down a lot. And we did that totally correctly 9 weeks in a row. I made $120,000, which back in the 1980s was a lot of money. We're on the front page of the Wall Street Journal, and people were quite amazed and sympathetic to the idea that we really demonstrated that things that occur in the future, that as we were sitting on a Monday forecasting, is silver going up or down by the end of the week. So the viewer would get feedback on Friday, and he had to say on a Monday what he would receive for feedback 5 days later. So we would show him an object corresponding to whether silver went up or down. So he had to describe the shape or the smell or the feeling associated with what we would hand him at week's end. So let's say the object that he finally got handed with a small perfume bottle. So he might say on Monday, in fact, he did say on Monday, I see a cylindrical glass vial. It has a stopper in each end and it has a funny smell. Let me draw that for you. And that's what he drew. And his target was a perfume bottle left over from the days on airplanes where they used to give you nice little souvenirs like a bottle of perfume to take with you. So he perfectly described this little perfume vial that was not selected until the market closed on Friday. So Monday, the important thing here is to understand is that Monday he had the experience and the pictures in his mind corresponding to what was going to happen on Friday. And the thing that was going to happen Friday was not determined until that Friday. So his experience on Monday that he described was caused by events that occurred at a later time. So that's what we mean by timeless awareness. And that was all understood 2,000 years ago.
Yeah, I think it's important for people to realize, like, we want people to get an idea of what remote viewing is. It's how you can, from a distant space, draw and see what's going on elsewhere. But in addition to this, it's also, as amazing as that is, it's also outside of time. As Russell's saying, is that you can predict the future and you can go back. You even had some drawings where he drew it, and it was how the city looked 75 years ago, right? It's completely outside of time.
Pat Price was a great psychic policeman. And one of the first trials we did with him, Hal Putoff, who was my co-founder of the program, and Kit Green, who was the contract monitor, they were shown a randomly chosen target location. So they went to Palo Alto's swimming pool complex, and I had no idea what was in this target pool. And they were at the place, and the guy I was with, Pat Price, said, I see a circular body of water and a rectangular body of water and two big water tanks. It looks to me like a water purification plant. And he said the rectangular body of water is about 80 by 100 feet, and the round body of water is about 90 feet in diameter. And all of that was correct, but there was no water tanks at the place. That was incorrect. And of course, it was not a water purification plant, but his dimensional, architecturally accurate picture of the round pool and the rectangular pool were completely correct. So we consider that he's on the right place. He looked at the right target, but he had this erroneous pair of water tanks. And we said, well, he saw our story in 1975 when we did that was Pat Price described the target, but having seen the water, he made up the fact that it was a water purification plant. That was our story. 10 years later, after Pat's death, Palo Alto was celebrating its 100th anniversary, and all the residents, including myself, we all got a picture book of what Palo Alto looked like 100 years ago. And at the swimming pool complex, today is known as Rinconada Park, it used to be a water purification plant. And at that site were two big water tanks, which at that time, the 1870s, would have been the tallest thing in the city of Palo Alto. Those two big water tanks were exactly where Price had drawn them. So Price looked to see where Hal and Kit were hiding and described that completely correctly. And then he looked around down the timeline. So he looked 5 miles south on Middlefield Road to the park and 75 years into the past to describe the biggest thing there, which was the water tank, which is, of course, no longer there. So people are able to see into the distance, into the future, and into the past.
That's amazing. It's like it's beyond just the ability to see externally. It's also time. So my big question here is, How do you know what the target is? Like, I understand when you give a remote viewer a longitude, latitude, that's giving them an X, and they can say, "Oh, I know what's there. There's a water tower there." But you want to say Hal Puthoff's in South America somewhere, or to look at something from 75 years ago. How do they hone in on that? How do they know what to look for?
Well, in the South American target, I don't know if you can see the airport on the right, on my right side here. Hal had gone to South America, and each day Pat Price would say, Hal is at a market, or Hal is at a volcano, or is it a church? Then on day 5, so we're having an emergency in Palo Alto, and I will try and turn that off.
You should have remote viewed that into the future and told us that beforehand, Russell.
That's right. So on day 5, Pat didn't show up. So in the spirit that the show must go on, I said, okay, I'll do it. And I said, I see an airport on an island. And on the right side, there's sand and gravel. And on the left side, there's an airport building. And I drew that. And that's shown on the bottom of my illustration on the wall. And I don't know if you can see that. And in fact, what I had drawn was an airport with the airport on the left and the grass on the right. And that greatly corresponds to the airport where Hal had gone to hide, which was not in Colombia, but he had taken a side trip to an island called San Andreas, 100 miles offshore. So this is like a trick in the film, in Third Eye Spies. He said, I thought I would trick the people. I would leave where I was. Their target was, where is Hal Puthoff at noon? And he was not at Colombia, but he was at a island airport. And even though I'm not a famous remote viewer, I had seen many, many people doing remote viewing. So I just closed my eyes and I had this picture of an island airport pop into my awareness. And like a good remote viewer, I just drew what I saw. And this drawing of an airport on the island is the only thing I put down on the paper, which I dated. And the important thing about this is that it shows that remote viewing is so easy that even a scientist can do it.
No, wait. That brings me right to my next question. I was going to say that you say that anybody can do this. It's a matter of quieting the mental noise, and the trick is pushing the conscious mind out of the way and keep it from filling your session with logical representation of data that you acquire, like the analytic overlays that we have.
That would be a correct phenomenological description of what a person was doing. And I might say that at a lecture. If I'm sitting down with you and I tell you I've got an interesting object in my pocket,
hey,
and I'm going to show it to you in a little while, and that's the story of what we're doing. I've got an interesting object in my pocket, and I'll show it to you in a little while. That's a setup. My instructions to you are take a couple of deep breaths, quiet your mind, assuming you know what that means, and tell me about the surprising image that shows up in your awareness. That's it. Those are the magic words. If you would just, it's nothing about signal to noise ratio, nothing about metal noise. You're a viewer who's never done this before, and I will simply tell you, quiet your mind, and now I want you to describe the surprising image that what shows up in your awareness. And that's how I've supported myself for the past 40 years doing that magic trick. You would have people from the government come to the laboratory, right up to the Undersecretary of Defense, who came in helicopter and landed in our parking lot. He said, well, we're about to give you another $500,000. I want to see for myself how this works. And he was sitting in our little laboratory. He said, well, who is your psychic today? This is Walter LaBerge, Undersecretary of Defense under Clinton. And I said, well, you will do that, sir. Because what we've learned, I know that you don't believe in this stuff, But what we've learned is that if I bring you Ingo Swann or Uri Geller or some famous psychic, and he describes where your major is hiding, you'll think it's a trick. You'll go back to Washington with your majors. That did they follow you? How could you know that? But if I sit here with you and say, my buddy Hal put off, and your major got some traveling orders randomly chosen from a stack of 50 with a random number generator, and then they drove someplace, and then you and I sat here and you drew a picture, you'll know that that's not a magic trick, because when you go back to Washington, you will have that mental image of what you actually saw with me and compare that with the pictures we took when you went to wherever the hell they've gone. You understand that, sir?
Right. Yeah.
He said, okay, what do I do? And I said, well, they're at their place now. If you quiet your mind and simply draw a picture of the surprising images that just pop up in your awareness. Just look for a surprise. Don't name it. Don't try and grab it. Just draw the surprising thing, even if it makes no sense. And he drew a very nice picture of a circular brick conference center with a water fountain in the middle. So he drew the fountain in the middle, surrounded by a brick patio. He said, that's what I get. And we then took him to that very spot. And he said, my God, that's just what I drew.
Amazing.
And that's what I did for a decade at SRI. So I did not do any remote viewing except for the one I showed you. But when I would visit, and I did this with the administrator of NASA as well, George Pesdertz, and Werner von Braun. I could tell you a story about von Braun. Coincidences are an interesting part of this, because coincidences are sort of uncaused relationships. There's a little story about how our program got started, which is one coincidence after another. I gave a lecture at Esalen, which is a retreat center on the Pacific coast, in 1972. I had an ESP teaching machine, which you can still get at no cost from the Apple iStore. So if you've got an iPhone, at no cost, you can download my ESP teaching machine. So I had this in 1972 and gave a lecture on how people can learn to develop their psychic abilities. And Mike Murphy is the founder of Esalen, was at my lecture. A week later, Mike called me and said, I liked your talk about American and Soviet research. I have an engagement to speak at Grace Cathedral in San Francisco, and I can't do it. Could you give my talk? Just tell the people what you said. And I said, I can do that. So I gave the talk at Grace Cathedral, large auditorium at a church in San Francisco. And after the end of it, a guy came up to me and said, my name is Art Reitz. I'm the director of new projects at NASA. That was an amazing talk you gave about American and Soviet research. Could you give that at a conference next week on St. Simon's Island on speculative technology? We'll have people from all over the world doing new stuff. And I said, since what was on my mind, the SRI program did not exist yet. What was on my mind is I wanted to give up lasers and start an ESP lab. So I could see in my future that this might be just where I want to go. So I went to this island and I had my ESP teaching machine, and Werner von Braun was there. He's a great techie, as you know, inventor of the V2 rocket and head of our rocket program. And he was interested in the psychic machine. He said, my grandmother was very psychic. Everyone in the family knew that she was very psychic. How does this machine work? And I said, well, the machine will choose one of 4 pictures, and I want you to push the button corresponding to the picture. There you go, it's by magic. You want to push the button corresponding to the light that will be illuminated. And he did that, and you get 24 trials, and he got about 12 of them right, which is independently significant. And each time you press the right one, it rings a bell. He said, that's amazing. And then he did it again and maybe even got more than 12 right. He said, let's show this to the administrator. So Von Braun, who's head of the NASA rocket program, took me to Jim Fletcher, who's head of all of NASA, and said, this guy, Russ Targ, he's built laser stuff for us in the past, and he now is trying to set up an ESP lab at Stanford. I think we ought to give him a little money. And I was asking for $80,000. So out of the fact that Mike Murphy couldn't give his talk, I was invited to this secret conference. That's where the first money for SRI came. People in parapsychology have always had an extremely hard time getting money. So based on this concatenation of surprising, uncaused events, I found myself on an island off the coast of Georgia, meeting Werner von Braun, the administrator of NASA, and with no further ado, no proposal, no nothing, the head of NASA said, okay, we'll give you 80K. And within a week, I was in the office of Charlie Anderson, the president of SRI, accompanied by Edgar Mitchell, who's an astronaut who just came back from space. And Mitchell said, yes, indeed, I was there with Von Braun and Mitchell and Fletcher, and they promised some money if Russ could start a program. Charlie Anderson said, well, if you guys can keep a low profile, I'll let you start the program. And that amazing collection of coincidences was the beginning of the SRI program.
Russell, a guy like me might call that a synchronicity.
I would call it exactly a synchronicity.
Now, you also have another synchronicity that you were one time on your way in a cab on the way to go to another conference to tell the story of you doing the remote view of Hal Puthoff on San Andreas, and the driver was from there. Do you remember that? He had a picture. He had a picture of San Andreas. Right? Would you call that a synchronicity as well?
I was coming to a conference and talking to the cab driver, as I always do, that I'm from New York, and you always chat up the cab driver. And I said, one of the most amazing things I did is he wanted to know, are you psychic? And I said, well, only one time I did a remote viewing where the psychic didn't show up. And the guy went to hide at an airport in San Andreas Island in the Caribbean. And he said, well, I used to live there. I know all about San Andreas. In fact, I have a color picture of San Andreas Island. Would you like to have that? And I said, I would love to have that, because my photograph here is from 1975, where everything was still in black and white. So from his iPhone, he sent me a good-looking color picture of that airport, reflecting exactly what I had drawn 30 years earlier.
So, Russell, what are these synchronicities? Because they happen to us all the time, and we want to know what those are. What does that mean to you?
It means that your consciousness has access to distant points in space and time. We live in the ordinary force space. You remember Einstein said there are 3 space dimensions in 1 time dimension. He did that with the help of Minkowski, a Polish mathematician who knew all about force space, and he had created force space to solve a different problem. But when Einstein showed up, Minkowski had this all ready for him to solve the problem that Einstein couldn't solve, because you needed a complex space-time, 3 real dimensions and 1 imaginary dimension, 1 complex dimension. So that was Minkowski's help to Einstein to create this 4-dimensional space-time. In order for your consciousness to describe things that are happening in the distance and in the future, you need this 4-dimensional space-time, but instead of just having the time dimension being complex, you need all the dimensions complex. So there a total of 8 dimensions. Now, it's important to understand, I'm not creating some new dimensions. I'm not saying, well, ESP is complicated, let's add in some new dimensions. I'm saying the world is made in such a way as the 4 dimensions that we're familiar with, that Minkowski gave us, 3 real dimensions and 1 complex dimension. Actually, they're all complex. And Minkowski knew that in 1905. But he was thinking about it for other purposes. So if the world is really has all complex dimensions, what that means is that your consciousness has contact with any distant point in space-time, and there will always be a path from where you're sitting at here and now to some future place there and then. That is, you have coordinates X, Y, Z in some time T0, and Hal Puthoff is some other place ABC in time T2. That's just another point in the space-time, which may or may not be in the future, but it's just another point. For a mathematician or for a physicist, I'm here in Palo Alto now. You're somewhere else, might be in the future, but we're just sitting at 2 points in space-time. And my consciousness doesn't need to know the coordinates, but my desire is for my attention to be where you are in space-time. For example, if you were interested, you could have taken a wild-ass guess and described the object I had in my pocket, and I'd have shown it to you. And I used to do that on Coast to Coast Radio with Art Bell. I would talk to him and he'd say, okay, Russ, I'm holding up something in my hand. What have you got there? I'm out here in the desert. Tell me what you got. And I, many times between midnight and 2 a.m., I would play that game over the radio with Art Bell.
Awesome.
So the idea that we live in a complex space-time doesn't have to change. You're driving your car from your house to the studio. You just realize that your consciousness has access to other points in space-time.
Yeah, hold on. Don't leave us hanging there on the Art Bell stuff. Did you get it right ever?
Frequently.
Awesome.
Frequently.
Well, Russell, I want to ask you, since we're a space and time, we've talked a lot about remote viewing on planet, but what about remote viewing off planet? Have you worked with people that have done a lot of remote viewing that reaches into different realms besides just here on planet?
Not a lot. We had one spontaneous synchronicity. We were just getting ready to start our ESP teaching program with NASA. That ESP teaching game that you showed was actually an $80,000 NASA program.
Oh, wow.
to teach astronauts how to get in touch with the spacecraft. So that was a year-long program, and our contract monitor, George Pesdertz, at the time, who was the NASA administrator, said, you know, Russ, we're about to launch the Pioneer 2 spacecraft to Jupiter, and Ingo's sitting with us. I said, Ingo, could you tell us, are we going to find anything surprising at Jupiter? Is there anything we're going to find that we didn't know about? So Ingo said, well, let me see. He took a big puff on his cigar and said, give me your pad there and I'll draw something. And he said, well, I'm looking at Jupiter now. There's a ring right around Jupiter. There's a ring of ice crystals. And George said, you must be thinking of Saturn, right? Saturn's got a ring. He said, George, I've been looking at the solar system for my entire lifetime, for 60 years. I know the difference between Jupiter and Saturn. I'm looking at Jupiter, the huge, huge planet, and there's this pretty small but continuous ring of ice crystals all the way around. When you get there, you'll see them. So here's my picture of what that looks like. And you send me back a picture of what you see when you get there. And 8 months later, we got pictures from NASA, from George Pesdurz, showing the ice crystals just the way
Wow.
Ingo had drawn that.
That is incredible.
And in my book, the book that I just published, The Reality of ESP, I show the NASA photographs of the ice crystal ring and Ingo's drawing, and the drawing even greatly resembles the photograph that NASA took. So Ingo was able to cast his attention 500 million miles away and describe what was going on there. So the distance and the time did not impede him at all. He was able to say, right now, here we are in Menlo Park, California. Let me take a second to cast my mind 500 million miles out to Jupiter.
That's crazy.
And I'll tell you what I find. And that little experiment took about 5 minutes.
Incredible.
Well, real quick, I just want to have one more question. Do you find that there's certain spots like Bermuda Triangle, Alaskan Triangle, certain spots around the world that maybe you've tried that enhanced remote viewing is more than usual, or pretty much anywhere in the world that you've tried or other people have tried remote viewing is about the same?
Well, there's enough variability in psychic functioning. Mathematicians say the variance is so high that it's really hard to tell that this is a better spot than other spots. There are people like Hella Hammond, who is a dear friend of ours and a photographer. She was brought in as a control. The CIA wanted us to say, you've worked with Ingo Swann now, who's a lifelong psychic, and Pat Price, who obviously has prodigious ability that he's had all of his life. Can't you bring in somebody who's never done this before? And Hella agreed to do with this. And it turned out that Hella was the most successful psychic of anyone who's ever come to our lab in formal experiments. I wouldn't say she's the most psychic person we ever saw, but in formal experiments describing where somebody was hiding in this formal psychic hide and go seek, she did better than anybody else. And she was the control person. Ingo Swann is, of course, a lifelong psychic. Pat Price did many, many successful things for us and for the government. What kept us in business for a decade was Pat Price's description of a Soviet weapon factory in Soviet Siberia, where he described a 8-wheel gantry crane that rolled back and forth over a building that was making giant steel spheres that were part of a particle beam weapon. And he drew the spheres and he drew the crane, all of which were unknown until 2 years after his death, when the Russians finally rolled the sphere out. So he was able to describe things that nobody in the Western world knew anything about. And we then trained up 6 Army officers from Fort Meade. The Army Intelligence Command, INSCOM, Army Intelligence Command, wanted us to train up a psychic Army Corps so they didn't have to come to California to look for psychics. I mean, coming to California looking for psychics is embarrassing enough. They wanted to be able to at least work with their own psychics.
Right.
And we trained half a dozen people, and Ingo trained 6 more. So for more than a decade, Joe McMonagle was the star of the Fort Meade group, the outstanding psychic. We wouldn't say anybody is more psychic than Joe. He's one of the great psychics in our program, up there with Ingo Swann and Pat Price. And he could describe anything on the planet or off the planet. Well,
I want to ask you this. I mean, you're saying that the ESP is the proof for ESP is so strong that it would be statistically unreasonable to deny it. Can you explain that a little bit more so people can understand that?
Well, in any kind of physics experiment or psychology experiment, you think you've discovered something. You've discovered some particle that is hard to see, pops in and out. How do you know that it's there? And it's not always there. So you get a lot of people who spend a lot of time looking for this electron. And you do this complicated experiment, and some of the time it's here, some of the time it's there, but most of the time it'll be within a certain range of locations.
Right.
And then people all over the world can do this experiment. And although the thing doesn't hold still, you have a pretty good idea what its mass is, what its velocity is. Then you can publish papers, and people agree that although this thing is really moving around and you can't pin it down, there is such a thing as an electron. And you would then have many, many papers, and you say, well, we agree that although you can't really see it with your naked eye, the evidence is quite good that the world does have electrons. And the evidence is so strong that it would be silly to deny it, because we can do things with it. Well, psychic ability is like that. We don't always get the right answer. Some people are better than others at getting the right answer. But when the CIA came to us and said there's a Russian airplane that crashed in northern Africa, and we can't find it because it's in the jungle and it's full of code books. The bomber is a reconnaissance mission, and we want to get the code books before the Russians, and we can't find it with satellites because it's under the jungle. Could you find it? So one of our psychics, together with a psychic from the Air Force, was able to get a map of northern Africa and say, well, there's a mountain range here, the river here, the village here. Between the village and the river, that's where the plane went down. And the female psychic drew a little circle, and the CIA then launched a helicopter trip with 4 agents, put it down secretly in Zaire, and as they landed in the place where the woman said to land it, the group of natives were coming out of the jungle carrying pieces of the airplane.
Huh.
So we say that, and we did that for 2 decades. So after being asked to describe the health of hidden American hostages, find a American kidnapped general in Italy, find this downed airplane in Zaire, describing a huge Russian submarine. And time after time, we supported ourselves by locating people and describing hidden stuff during the whole Cold War. So first of all, say, what's the probability? Well, we supported ourselves by being psychic for 20 years. That's pretty improbable.
Right, that alone.
If I told you that we got a couple of $1 million a year from the CIA for doing tasks for them, finding sick people, hidden airplanes, Soviet bomb tests, so forth. I said, we did that for 2 decades for the CIA. You would say, well, I think probably you were doing something useful.
That's right. Here's the problem I have with this, Russell. You guys were doing this in the early 70s with astonishing results. You've gave many examples today of accounts. And you don't really hear about remote viewing anymore outside of our community again. And even then, it's sort of the same. Everything else in life seems to get better and build on itself. Like by now, why would you not be able to read the serial number on a dollar bill? Why is this not bigger? Why is this not more proven?
Well, those are 2 different questions. The easy question is, why can't you read a number on a dollar bill? And the answer is, that's simply not what remote viewing does. For example, I could tell you, I'm holding a dollar bill in front of the camera. Can you read it? And you would say, no, of course I can't read it. It's too small. What do you think? That's a ridiculous thing to ask me to do. And the answer is, in the psychic world, the serial number on a dollar bill is just too small. It's also an analytical task. psychic functioning doesn't come from the analytical part of the brain, doesn't come from your right hemisphere, as it were. So it's very hard to read or do arithmetic or do any kind of analytical task. If I tell you I've got a odd object in my pocket, could you make a drawing of the surprising image that I'm going to show you in a little while? That corresponds to psychic functioning, even though it's just as hard as a dollar bill. Describing the serial number on the dollar bill is a pure analytical task. Nobody can do that. Nobody's ever been able to do that, and they're not going to be able to do that because it doesn't correspond to what the ability allows you to do.
Okay, well, hold on, Russell, but I'm saying what I'm getting at here, buddy, is that you guys are very convinced that this is, okay, not the dollar bill thing, but you guys can remote view. You feel very strongly about this. They've been doing these programs for years and years and years. Why couldn't we today put 10 of these guys in a room, put it on the internet, and say, we're going to find Jimmy Hoffa's body by Monday morning and prove to the world that this is a real thing?
That's an interesting task. Probably we could, assuming his body is somewhere. That is, if you believe the film that was just released called The Irishman, it's very likely that his body was cremated and burned to a crisp. So,
okay, well, maybe a different task. Maybe
give us a task that's impossible. If you give us a task that's a good task would be
Amelia Earhart's airplane.
How about the closing price on the silver market next Friday?
Okay, well, why don't we do that so that the whole world will then believe, because that would be incredible.
We did that 9 times in a row.
I know, but I mean, you know that, I know that, we believe you, but much of the world does not believe in remote viewing. Why can't we do something that would kind of make them more really believe this?
I completely agree with you. I retired from doing that. I did that experiment right here in this house where I'm sitting with a psychic and an investor and a broker. I set the whole stage, and we did that 9 weeks in a row. I'm too old to suffer the.
Tony will take up the reins for you. Well, I guess we're getting at what about people that
the answer is I've been trying to get 2 labs to do that. I completely agree with you that although we were able to publish our findings in Nature magazine, the premier scientific journal in the world,
sure,
and the proceedings of the Electrical Engineers Society and the Institute of Physics Society. So in the scientific world, I have several A+ papers published in premier journals, and normally that would be convincing. Our problem is that we don't know for a fact how ESP works. We have some pretty good ideas. Basically, we ran out of money in the 1950s because CIA was embarrassed by being teased over supporting psychic research. That was, you wouldn't think that teasing the CIA would be a profitable thing to do, but they just said we're doing well enough. We don't. Congress didn't want to support them anymore.
I guess what I'm getting at is, what about the people that say that your work has been pseudoscience? Wouldn't you want to sort of prove it true?
Yes, I would like to have psychic abilities established as a genuine science.
Yes.
Normally, the way you would do that is by publishing it in top-rate journals and have other people in other laboratories do the same. We did that, but because it still makes people think of occult physics from the 16th century, and until we're getting closer. You see, we're getting closer and closer to modern physics. The idea of non-locality, it may have been in the 1960s to say psychic functioning is independent of space and time, that would be a big strike against it. That shows that it's definitely not electromagnetic. But now there are lots of things in modern physics that are independent of space and time. So the fact that ESP can now be said to be non-local is not a problem. It's a descriptor making it occurrent with other things in modern physics that are also non-local in space and time. So psychic research and modern physics are getting closer together. We still don't have a formal model. So there's really two different questions. One is, how do you make a model to successfully describe how ESP works? That's a valid question. Another one is, without a model, how do you convince people that it really exists? Well, the average person doesn't give a damn what's published in Nature magazine.
I was going to say that's.
But when we made $100,000 in the silver market, that got us on the front page of the Wall Street Journal.
Right, it's all about the money.
So what I'm proposing, there are two existing labs that are doing work. I propose that I will help get you some dough if you will get your thoughtful researchers together and replicate our silver experiment and maybe make $1 million instead of $100,000 because we're
that put you on the front page.
If Institute of Noetic Sciences, which has a lab in Northern California, if you repeated our silver forecasting and made $1 million, that might be a step toward having people believe that ESP is real.
Yeah, I mean, I do think it's funny. We've been working with this, ESP for a long time, even as a kid in the 80s. I remember hearing all about it, but yeah, definitely. I mean, times have changed, though. I mean, we hear there's a psychic on every corner now, and I think it's like the Ancient Aliens with the show. People have gotten so bombarded with technology and information. So I think right now it'd be hard to even want to prove to these people because a lot of people don't really care. They just.
Well, when I was making this film, I produced this film called Third Eye Spies.
Right.
And Kit Green was one of our contract monitors in the CIA. And we asked him on camera, this thing worked very well. You and your buddy Ken Chris agree that the CIA supported us for 2 decades, and we were doing, not only did you support ESP, but it was useful. It seems to me unreasonable that you're not doing it at your place anymore, since I did in fact train up 2 of your CIA agents, and they did remarkable experiments which I've published. And he said, well, the best of my knowledge, they're still doing it. They're just doing it quietly. So when you say, if this is so good, why isn't the CIA doing it? My answer is, well, to the best of my knowledge, they are doing it.
I believe that. Let me ask you a tough question, Russell. Why is it that you believe consciousness can exist outside of time and space, and I guess, beyond death?
Well, that's what the evidence support. There's several reasons. That is, Ingo Swann can sit in the office and describe what's going on at Jupiter 500 million miles away. So that's pretty much off the planet, independent of, to the best of our ability to measure psychic functioning, it's independent of space. We've done the best we can. We can see out 500 million miles. That should sort of answer that question. The other thing is that we can forecast, we can do remote viewing of the future. Where is it going to be at a later time? And that works exactly as well as contemporaneous remote viewing. In fact, when I went to Soviet Union in 83 and 84, they were doing remote viewing at the University of Soviet Armenia. And they had the same kind of experiments we had, and they thought that their precognition experiments actually worked a little better than the real-time experiments. And we observe that as well. So if you can see into the distance and into the future, that's what you mean by consciousness is independent of space and time.
Gotcha.
And if you could put it into the mouth of Padmasambhava, and he said, that's your nature. But that's not a religious idea. He said, I'm putting it in his mouth, he is saying, I've been a lifetime meditator. I've spent thousands of hours in meditation. And my experience is that I'm able to experience what's going on in the distance and into the future. And I think that's my nature because that's what I experience when I quiet my mind. So in his book, whatever it is,
yeah,
looking at quieting your mind by seeing into the future, he's just sharing with you his experience of seeing into the distance and into the future. So the idea that our nature is timeless awareness is not a religious proposition. It's what experienced meditators discover from quieting their mind.
Russell, you say that the meaning of life is to experience our primordial spacious awareness and teach that. What else should we take away from all your years of reading all these old books and reading all these philosophers and studying and researching this? What should we take away from you? What can you pass on to us?
Well, that's a pretty important idea, that if somebody is depressed, overcome with fear from the coronavirus, I can just tell them that the evidence is very strong that consciousness survives bodily death. That's not, there's a vast literature that some people who die are able to communicate with their loved ones back, or people even in a laboratory back on Earth. The Buddhists believe in reincarnation, and I think that the evidence for that exists, but is weaker. The evidence that people who have died can communicate or send messages to people who are living, that data is very, very strong. And I've had some evidence of that. My darling daughter Elizabeth, who died 20 years ago, periodically sends messages to other people that they should communicate with me. And frequently she sends back information which only she and I knew.
That's compelling.
So and there she is now.
That's her now. Yeah, it's exactly what it is.
She sent a message to a mutual friend who was in a job interview, and her presence was so strong that one of the people said, do you know someone who's died recently? And my friend said yes. She said, well, she has a message for her father, and this message is something that is absolutely only known to her and her father. And if you give this message to her father, he will then be convinced that my awareness is still present. And that was successful. That is, the information that my friend gave me was basically of bad child rearing when she was a 3-year-old. As my wife and I did not abuse her, but we were not very astute with a way of treating her. And it was a traumatic thing that happened to 3-year-old Elizabeth. And the deceased Elizabeth, that is what appears, is that the deceased Elizabeth told this story to a medium, and the medium conveyed the story to me. And it was something absolute. It was just an embarrassing event, but absolutely nobody knew about it because we wouldn't have told anybody.
That's compelling.
So basically, to not make this a mystery, my wife and I stuffed the little 3-year-old into a dress and she had never worn dresses before. She wore overalls. So my mother had sent a dress to us.
The little red dress.
And we had to stuff Elizabeth into this dress to take her to the airport. And this is traumatic because my wife didn't wear dresses and she didn't want to. And
you weren't going to.
And that was that. But so we didn't abuse her. We just traumatized her.
Gotcha.
And she was able to relate that 40 years later. So I'm convinced.
It's awesome. It makes me convinced. Russell, tell us about, we've kept you way too long here. We're going to let you go. Tell us about the reality of ESP.
Well, the reality of ESP is the last book that I wrote, where I was able to tell for the first time the experiments we had done for the CIA and the Defense Intelligence Agency. So we could talk about the early days of Pat Price and Ingo Swann at SRI, and then reveal in detail what we did for the government now that it was all declassified. So I was able to describe the protocol that we used, and I have a chapter in The Reality of ESP to describe how you work with a friend. I can't tell you how to find a friend. You're up to your own. Assuming you can find a friend, you and that person can teach each other how to quiet your mind, and each of you can bring an object for the other one to describe. And we have a bunch of stages where you and your friend over a period of weeks can learn what it feels like, how you we teach you how to separate the psychic signal from the mental noise. The mental noise is memory and imagination and analysis. The psychic signal is a surprising image that shows your awareness. And we can teach you how to do that. If I'm at a conference, for example, I will stand on the stage. Takes me back to when I was doing stage magic as a high school student, where I would pretend to read people's mind. But now I'm a paid entertainer to really do magic. So I will stand on the stage and say, I've got an interesting object in the box here. There are hundreds of people here. I want you to describe the surprising image that shows up in your awareness. And I'm willing to tell the promoters of the organization that I'll tell the audience, we will give you your money back if you don't either do something psychic or see something psychic. And that always makes the producers very nervous. Like 1,500 people in the audience, and I'm promising to give them their money back. And my experience is that half the people will describe the thing properly, and the other half will see them do it. So in doing that on stage, bravado, I've never had anybody ask for their money back.
That's pretty awesome. Listen, guys, check out The Reality of ESP. He also has an iPhone app that's for free that he put out, which is that machine he referenced earlier. It's called the ESP Trainer on your iPhone. And he's got the movie Third Eye Spies, which tells this whole story that Russell's been relating to us today from the inception till the very end of the program. And he's got memoirs of a blind biker.
There it is.
What a perfect title that is, Memoirs of a Blind Biker. Because up till recently, Russell used to ride his motorcycle. Even though he's legally blind, he would ride his motorcycle. Right, Russell?
That's my best magic trick.
That's it. So be safe on the roads out there, people, when Russell's out there on his motorcycle.
Well, you can be cheered up that I've given up the motorcycle.
It's safe out there, folks. Well, right. Russell, thanks for coming on and talking to us. We really appreciate it. You did amazing work. Hopefully it will continue. Hopefully more people will open up and learning about remote viewing and other aspects of this phenomenon.
Well, if you find somebody who wants to do the silver forecasting, I will help them do it.
Oh, great.
That'd be great. We'll look into it.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. I'm very happy to chat with you.
Thank you so much, as always. And thank you, everybody, for joining us and participating in the chat room. I know Russell and all of us appreciate your support and everything we do. And until next time, I'm Tony Sweet with Captain Ron for Truth Be Told. We'll see you next time.
So long.